Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Headline Spotlight. I'm Frank King, and today we bring you the most important stories from around the world. Let's dive right in. Georgia high school shooting. Tragedy strikes at Appalachia High School. Our top story today, a heart-wrenching tragedy in Georgia. 4 people, 2 students and 2 teachers, were killed and 9 others injured in a shooting at Appalachia High School. The suspect, a 14-year-old student named Colt Gray, is in police custody and will be charged with murder. Law enforcement officials are still investigating, while the community mourns this devastating loss. Barrow County Sheriff Judd Smith expressed the community's shock and grief, stating, "Hate will not prevail in this county." President Biden and Vice President Harris have both issued statements condemning the violence, with Biden emphasizing the tragic frequency of such shootings. Former President Trump also called the event tragic on Truth Social. As the nation grapples with yet another school shooting, authorities are working with local, state, and federal agencies, including the FBI, to get to the bottom of this horrific event. Barrow County schools will remain closed for the rest of the week. Navy commander relieved of duty over backward rifle scope incident. In military news, the commander of the USS John McCain and Navy destroyer has been relieved of duty following a photo scandal earlier this year. Commander Cameron Yass was seen firing a rifle with a backward-mounted scope, leading to significant online ridicule. The Navy cited a loss of confidence in his ability to command, although they didn't provide further details. The destroyer is currently deployed in the Gulf of Oman, assisting in the protection of the aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt. NVIDIA stock market shakeup. Record loss amid AI uncertainty. Next, a massive shakeup in the stock market. NVIDIA, the company at the heart of the AI revolution, saw its stock drop by 9.5%, wiping out nearly $300 billion in market value, the largest single-day loss for a U.S. company ever. Despite its recent dominance in AI technology, concerns over economic slowdowns and the timeline for AI's profitability have spooked investors. NVIDIA has been a key player in fueling the AI boom, with companies like Microsoft and Meta spending billions on its chips. But questions remain about whether these investments will lead to meaningful returns. Analysts caution that while AI holds immense potential, the path to long-term profitability is still unclear. With NVIDIA's stock volatility, the global market remains on edge. Tim Walz's family shows support for Trump. In a surprising twist on the campaign trail, family members of Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, who's running as Vice President Kamala Harris's running mate, have come out in support of former President Donald Trump. A photo shared online shows 8 relatives of Walz in Nebraska wearing T-shirts that read, "Walz is for Trump." Though distant relatives, their public endorsement has raised eyebrows, and Trump himself has responded, hinting at a possible meeting with Governor Walz's older brother, Jeff, who has been vocal about his opposition to the vice presidential nominee. Grenfell Tower inquiry exposes decades of failures. Next, we turn to London, where a damning report on the 2017 Grenfell Tower fire has been released. The inquiry reveals that years of government and industry failures turned the high-rise into what's being called a death trap. 72 people perished in the blaze, which was fueled by flammable cladding added during a 2016 renovation. The report blames dishonest companies, incompetent regulators, and complacent government policies for allowing such unsafe materials to be used. Survivors are now calling for justice, and police will determine if manslaughter charges will be filed. Prime Minister Keir Starmer issued an apology, promising action on the report's recommendations, though prosecutions could take years. Spy whale found dead in Norway. In a story that captivated the world, Valdemir, the so-called Russian spy whale, has been found dead in southern Norway. The beluga whale first made headlines in 2019 when it was discovered with a harness believed to be from Russia, sparking rumors that the whale had been trained for military purposes. Valdemir was a friendly whale known for interacting with people along Norway's coast. Marine biologists were shocked to find his body over the weekend, with no visible signs of injury. The cause of death remains unknown, but his loss has saddened many who followed his adventures. Tragic bus crash outside school in China. In eastern China, a devastating accident has claimed the lives of 11 people. A bus, specially designed to transport students, lost control and crashed into a crowd of parents and students waiting outside a middle school in Tyne City, Shandong Province. Tragically, 5 students and 6 parents were killed in this horrific accident, and 13 others were injured. The driver is now in police custody, and authorities are investigating what caused the bus to veer out of control. Incidents like these are not uncommon in China, with a history of road accidents and attacks involving school children. Our hearts go out to the victims and their families. Deadly migrant vessel capsizes in the English Channel. We now turn to the English Channel, where tragedy struck again. A migrant vessel capsized, leading to the deaths of at least 10 people, with others still in critical condition. This latest disaster highlights the ongoing dangers migrants face in their desperate attempts to cross into the UK. Authorities continue their rescue operations and are investigating how this incident occurred. North Korea's deadly floods lead to executions. Over to Asia, where reports from South Korea suggest that North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un ordered the execution of at least 30 officials after deadly floods this summer. The floods, which devastated Chagang province in July, left thousands dead and destroyed homes and infrastructure. Kim blamed local authorities for their failure to prevent the disaster, calling their negligence unacceptable. Despite offers of aid from China, Russia, and South Korea, the North rebuffed help, insisting it could manage the crisis internally. This tragic event adds to the already high tensions on the Korean peninsula. The Pacific Ocean, largest and oldest basin on Earth. Finally, some fascinating science for you. Did you know that the Pacific Ocean, covering more than 30% of the Earth's surface, is not only the largest ocean but also the oldest? The oldest rocks found their date back an astonishing 200 million years. This massive ocean is so vast it could theoretically hold all of the world's continents within its boundaries. From its immense depths to its ancient origins, the Pacific Ocean remains one of nature's greatest wonders. That's it for today's top headlines. From heartbreaking tragedies to scientific marvels, we hope you're leaving here a little more informed. Tune in tomorrow for more updates from around the world. I'm Frank King, and this has been Headline Spotlight. Take care and stay informed. Good evening, everyone. Tonight's spotlight shines on a tragedy that rocked London back in 2017, the Grenfell Tower fire. 72 lives were lost in a disaster that a new report reveals could have been avoided had it not been for a deadly combination of government regulatory and industry failures. An inquiry into the fire concluded that there was no single cause behind the tragedy. Instead, it pointed to a web of dishonesty from companies, weak and incompetent regulators, and complacency from the government. The building was wrapped in combustible cladding, turning a small apartment fire into the deadliest blaze on British soil since World War II. The head of the inquiry, retired Judge Martin Morbick, called the Grenfell Tower a death trap, stating that the tragic loss of life was avoidable. The report paints a grim picture, with many parties, from architects to contractors, all sharing responsibility for what happened. And shockingly, it highlights that incompetence was only part of the problem. Some were driven by dishonesty and greed. Prime Minister Keir Starmer addressed Parliament with an apology on behalf of the British state, vowing to act on the report's findings. He said this should be a day of truth, but it must also lead to justice. For survivors and the families of those who perished, justice may still be a long way off. While prosecutions are possible, charges may not be filed until 2026. That's a long time to wait for answers, and for some, like Natasha Elcock of Grenfell United, the hurt and anger are palpable. Natasha, who lost her uncle in the fire, said, "We paid the price for systematic dishonesty, institutional indifference, and neglect." Let's rewind to the day of the fire, June 14, 2017. It started in a fourth-floor apartment and quickly engulfed the entire 25-story building. The fire raced upwards, fueled by the flammable cladding on the exterior walls. That cladding was made of aluminum and polyethylene, a plastic polymer that melts when exposed to heat. The question everyone was left asking was, how could something like this happen in modern-day London? The report was highly critical of the companies that manufactured the cladding materials. It accused them of manipulating safety tests, misleading regulators, and falsely claiming that the materials were safe. Celotex, Kingspan, and Arconic, three major players in the construction of Grenfell, have all expressed sympathies to the victims, but denied responsibility for the tragedy. The inquiry found that the combustible cladding was used because it was cheap, and nobody took full responsibility for ensuring it was safe. The inquiry also pointed a finger at the UK government, criticizing it for ignoring safety warnings in the years leading up to the fire. In fact, the report highlights that in the 7 years before the fire, the Conservative-led government had been focused on deregulation, which led to weakened enforcement of building standards. London's fire brigade also came under fire, no pun intended, for mismanaging the response to the disaster. The initial advice for residents to stay put in their apartments cost many lives. By the time that advice was changed, it was too late for those on the upper floors to escape. The Grenfell tragedy wasn't just a fire. It sparked a national debate about inequality in Britain. Grenfell Tower was a public housing building located in one of London's wealthiest neighborhoods. Most of the victims were people of color, and many came from low-income backgrounds. The fire exposed a harsh truth about how marginalized voices, especially from working-class communities and people of color, had been ignored. Since the fire, the UK has banned the use of metal composite cladding panels in new buildings and has ordered that combustible cladding be removed from hundreds of similar high-rises. But, as Prime Minister Starmer noted, the work has been far, far too slow. The report calls for sweeping changes, including tougher fire safety rules, the creation of a national fire and rescue college, and a single, independent regulator for the construction industry. The Grenfell Tower still stands today, covered in white sheeting, with a green heart and the words Grenfell Forever in our hearts emblazoned at the top. But for the families, like that of 12-year-old Jessica Urbano Ramirez, who lost her life in the fire, the pain and anger remain. Jessica's aunt, Sandra Ruiz, told reporters that there can be no justice until people are held accountable. Our lives were shattered on that night, she said. People who put profit above safety need to be behind bars. And there it is, a tragedy that didn't have to happen, yet did because of greed, dishonesty, and indifference. The Grenfell fire will forever stand as a grim reminder of the consequences of ignoring safety and, worse yet, ignoring people. That's today's Spotlight story. Stay tuned for more breaking news updates. I'm Frank King, and we'll see you again soon. Welcome to Spotlight Story, where we explore the fascinating details behind the systems and structures we rely on every day. I'm your host, Frank King. Today, we're diving into something many of us encounter daily, but might not think twice about: the U.S. interstate highway system. Ever wonder how those highways are numbered, or why they seem so perfectly organized across the country? Let's break it down. The planning for what we now call the Dwight D. Eisenhower National System of Interstate and Defense Highways, or simply the interstate system, began all the way back in the late 1930s. Back then, the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1938 asked the Bureau of Public Roads, now known as the Federal Highway Administration, to explore the idea of toll-financed highways. The result? A study that found toll roads wouldn't quite cover their costs. So instead, the plan shifted to a 26,700-mile highway network. By 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt formed a National Interregional Highway Committee. This group, led by Thomas H. McDonald, recommended a 33,900-mile system of expressways, which was eventually expanded to include urban routes as well. Fast forward to the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1944. Congress made things official by calling for up to 40,000 miles of national interstate highways. These routes would connect major cities and industrial centers across the country, supporting both transportation and national defense. But here's the kicker. No funds were actually set aside for this massive project until 1952. That's when the first $25 million for construction came through, and while it was a start, it wasn't until President Dwight D. Eisenhower's administration that things really kicked into high gear. In 1956, the Federal Aid Highway Act passed, boosting the network's length to 41,000 miles and setting national design standards. The government also agreed to cover 90% of the construction costs, and a dedicated highway trust fund was established, thanks to federal gas taxes. So, how are these highways designed? Well, the Act set the standards. These interstates were to be safe and efficient, with wide lanes, full control of access, and design speeds ranging from 50 to 70 miles per hour. Initially, the idea was to meet the traffic demands of 1975, but over time, the goal shifted to ensure the roads could adapt over a 20-year period. But let's get to the big question. How are they numbered? Here's where things get interesting. Interstate route numbers are far from random. They follow a specific pattern. Major routes are assigned 1 or 2-digit numbers. Odd-numbered routes, like I-5, run north to south, while even-numbered routes, like I-10, run east to west. And there's a system to the numbering. Lowest numbers are in the west for north-south routes, and in the south for east-west routes. That's why I-5 hugs the west coast, and I-10 stretches across the southern part of the country. Now, sometimes routes split into 2 branches. Take I-35 in Texas, for example. It divides into I-35E through Dallas and I-35W through Fort Worth, only to merge back together later. The same thing happens in Minnesota with I-35 near Minneapolis-St. Paul. 3-digit numbers are used for smaller, connecting routes. If you see a highway with an even-numbered prefix, like I-280 or I-480, it's typically a beltway or loop around a city. An odd-numbered prefix, like I-180, indicates a spur that connects to the main interstate at one end. And here's something to note. Each state handles this numbering system independently, so you may see the same numbers repeated in different states along a major route. Now, what about those exit numbers? States use one of 2 systems. There's consecutive numbering, where exits are numbered sequentially from the beginning of the route. But more commonly, you'll see the milepost system, where exits are numbered based on their distance from the route's starting point. So, if you're at milepost 4, you'll find exit 4, and so on. This makes it easy to track how far you've gone and how far you still have to go. So, there you have it. The next time you hit the road, you'll have a better understanding of how and why those interstates are laid out the way they are. It's not just a random web of roads. It's a meticulously planned system with a long history behind it. Thanks for tuning in to Spotlight Story. I'm Frank King, and I'll see you next time as we uncover more stories behind the scenes of everyday life. Welcome back to today's Spotlight Story. I'm your host, Frank King, and today we're diving into a fascinating question. Why do 80% of Americans live on the eastern side of the United States? Ever wonder why the East Coast feels so densely populated compared to the wide-open spaces of the West? Let's break it down. First off, it's all about history. Early European settlers, way back in the 1600s, made their homes on the East Coast. Places like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia became bustling hubs. These cities grew fast, and over time, people stayed in the region as industries and infrastructure were built around them. Basically, the East Coast had a head start, and it never looked back. Now, let's talk about economic development. When the Industrial Revolution kicked into high gear in the 1800s, cities like New York and Detroit became powerhouses of manufacturing and finance. The jobs, they were on the East Side. Even today, the East is home to major industries, educational institutions, and financial hubs that keep drawing people in. Then there's geography and transportation. You've got rivers like the Hudson, the Mississippi, and the Ohio, which were natural highways for trade and travel back in the day. Railroads and highways soon followed, connecting cities and making it easier for people to settle in these regions. And let's not forget, the East Coast is closer to Europe, which helped with trade and, you guessed it, immigration. But that's not all. The climate and resources in the East are also a big part of the story. Much of the region has a more moderate climate and rich, fertile land, perfect for farming and agriculture. Meanwhile, much of the West is tougher to live in, with deserts, mountains, and arid conditions making it harder to support large populations. Finally, there's urbanization. Most of the largest U.S. cities are in the East. Think New York City, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, and Chicago. These cities offer jobs, services, and cultural hotspots, attracting people from all over the country and the world. So, in short, the East Coast became home to early settlers. It's where the industrial boom happened. It had easier transportation routes, a friendlier climate, and today, it's where many of the biggest cities are. Put it all together, and it's easy to see why 80% of Americans live on the eastern side of the country. That wraps up today's episode of today's Spotlight Story. I'm Frank King, and as always, thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the stories shaping our world. See you next time